My name is John. I'm 36. Divorced a little over 2 years. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment outside Tampa. Nothing fancy, but clean, quiet, close enough to work that I don't lose half my life in traffic. I work at a supply company full of men who laugh too loud and believe every mistake they've ever made can be fixed with a cold beer and a shrug. My son Mason is 8. He stays with me every other weekend, and sometimes an extra night if the schedules line up. I keep his room ready all the time, even when he isn't there. Small bed, baseball glove on the windowsill, a faded dinosaur blanket on the mattress. He's almost outgrown but refuses to give up because, according to him, it's what makes the room feel like his. I never touched that blanket unless I was washing it. I need you to remember that blanket, because the story I'm about to tell you ends with me holding it in my hands years later and understanding finally where everything actually went wrong. Not the night a woman showed up at my door with wine on her breath and a confession she'd been rehearsing for weeks. Not the morning my best friend walked across a warehouse floor and called me a snake in front of half the building. Earlier than that. Quieter than that. It went wrong the afternoon I said yes when I should have said no. His name was Ryan. We'd worked together for years, the kind of friendship where you don't tell each other everything, but you'd answer the phone at midnight if the other one was stranded on the side of the road. I knew his wife, Lauren. I knew their 2 kids. I'd been to his backyard cookouts and listened to him talk about his family like a man who believed he'd done life right. He was the settled one, the anchored one. The guy you pointed to when someone asked if men our age could still keep it together. Then one Tuesday afternoon, he walked into my office looking like somebody had kicked a hole straight through his chest. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt was wrinkled. He smelled like a man who'd either slept in his car or hadn't slept at all. He stood by my desk, shifting his weight like he had too much adrenaline and nowhere to put it. And he said the one sentence I should have heard the warning inside of. "I need a favor, man, a real one." I should have asked more questions before I answered. I should have noticed that he already had a duffel bag and a box of clothes sitting in his trunk downstairs, packed before he ever opened his mouth. I should have thought about the fact that Mason's bed was not a spare bed. It was a child's bed in a child's room, with drawings on the fridge and small cars under the pillow. Instead, I told him he could stay. And that is how you invite a hurricane into a house that was never built to hold one. Not with a slammed door, not with a bad decision made in anger, with a shrug, with pity disguised as loyalty, with the specific stupid kindness men show each other in the middle of another man's humiliation. What came next cost me a friendship, a piece of my reputation, and every illusion I still had about what kind of man I was. It also brought me the woman I now live with. I'm not going to pretend that part away. But before any of it, the wine, the workplace screaming match, the phone call from his wife that finally told me the whole truth, there was just a key sliding into my lock and a man walking into my home with a story already loaded in his mouth. I let him in. Everything else is what happens after. Before I tell you what Ryan did to my home, I have to tell you what my home actually was. It wasn't much. That part I'll own. A 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a stucco building, the color of old sand, with a parking garage underneath and a palm tree out front that dropped dry fronds across every windshield parked beneath it. I had one assigned spot in the garage. I used it. The kitchen had a chip in the counter from when I dropped a cast iron skillet my first month living there alone. The couch was second-hand. The TV was bigger than it needed to be, because after the divorce I'd bought it on a Tuesday night out of spite for nobody in particular. But it was mine, every piece of it, and more than mine. It was the first place I'd built from scratch since I was 22 years old. Every adult address before it had Jenna's fingerprints on the choices, the color of the walls, the kind of coffee in the cupboard, which side of the bed was whose. When that marriage ended, I signed the lease on that apartment by myself, and for the first time in my adult life, I put a fork in a drawer because I wanted it there. Not because somebody had told me that was where forks went. That probably sounds small to you. It wasn't small to me. Here's the part I have to be honest about, because otherwise you won't understand how I made the choice I made. The divorce didn't break me the way divorces break some men. Jenna and I didn't end because anyone cheated. We ended because we wore each other down in slow, unspectacular ways, the way water wears down stone. Too many arguments about the same three things. Too much silence afterward. By the end, we couldn't even fight properly. We just went quiet in separate rooms and waited for the other one to leave first. What did break me, or at least crack me, was what came after. It was Sunday nights, when Mason had just gone back to his mother's, and the apartment was still warm from him being there. His cereal bowl in the sink, a Lego piece under my bare foot, the smell of kid sweat still faintly in the couch. It was realizing I had built a whole life around being a father, and somebody else had primary custody of the thing that made me feel most like a man. It was walking into his room on those Sunday nights, and just standing in the doorway because the bed was too small, and the dinosaur blanket was too bright, and the whole room was too quiet without him in it. That room was the last clean thing I had. I mean that literally. Everything else in my apartment I'd dragged some failure or compromise into. My bedroom had held a woman I dated briefly and shouldn't have. My couch had been the place I sat the night my father died, drinking too much and calling no one. My kitchen table had witnessed a tax return where I realized exactly how much the divorce had actually cost me. But Mason's room, nobody had damaged it. It was 8 years old in all the right ways. The glove on the windowsill still smelled like the leather oil I'd rubbed into it the Christmas I gave it to him. The little cars under the pillow were arranged in whatever pattern he'd left them in last visit, and I knew not to move them because he'd ask about them next time, and I wanted to be able to say honestly that I hadn't touched a thing. That was my wound, if you want to call it that. Not rage. Not bitterness toward my ex, just the low daily ache of a man who'd had a family and now had custody of a child's bedroom 2 weekends a month and treated that bedroom like a chapel because it was the only evidence he could point to. And I let Ryan sleep in it. The afternoon he asked, I already knew I was going to say yes before he finished the sentence. That's the ugly truth. I didn't wrestle with it. I didn't step away to think. I nodded while he was still talking, because in my head I was already measuring the logistics, where he'd put his clothes, whether he'd need a key, whether Mason was coming that weekend or the next. The moral question didn't even get a seat at the table. I skipped straight past it into hospitality, and hospitality is what men like me use to avoid thinking. I told myself the lies you'd expect. He's my friend. He'd do the same for me. It's just until he finds a place. It'll be a week, maybe 2. Mason's room is empty 5 nights out of 7 anyway. What kind of man turns away a friend with nowhere to sleep? The kind of man who protects his kid's bedroom like the chapel it is. That's who. But I wasn't that man that afternoon. I was a guy who wanted to feel useful to somebody, and Ryan had walked in offering me a role I could say yes to. We drove to the parking lot together after work. That's where I saw the duffel bag and the box in his trunk, already packed, already waiting. I remember standing by the open trunk with my keys in my hand and thinking, he didn't come to me to ask. He came to me to confirm. He'd decided I was the yes before he'd even left his house. That should have been my moment. Right there in the parking lot, with his life in a cardboard box and the Florida heat coming up off the asphalt. I could have said, hold on. I could have said, let's talk about this first. I could have asked one honest question, like when was the last time you slept at home, really? Or does Lauren know you're moving in with me? Or what happens when Mason comes this Saturday? I didn't ask any of them. I said, follow me. He followed me. The first night was quiet. He took a shower that lasted 35 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the way you watch a clock when you're waiting for a stranger to stop using your water. He came out in an old t-shirt, thanked me twice, and went straight into Mason's room and closed the door. I stood in my own living room listening to another grown man breathe on the other side of a wall where my son usually slept, and I told myself this was temporary. I said the word out loud. Temporary, like it was a prayer that worked if you repeated it. The second night he came home late, the third night later. By the end of the first week, I was adjusting my own habits without noticing. Turning the TV down, shutting cabinets softer, stepping around the bathroom when his toothbrush was wet because I didn't want to acknowledge that it was now sitting next to mine. I asked him once that first week if he'd been in touch with Lauren. He looked at his beer for a long time before he answered. Then he said, I don't know what's fixable anymore. I understood what he meant. Or I thought I did. I heard my marriage is bleeding out and I'm not sure I can save it. That's the generous reading. The generous reading is what I went with, because it's what I wanted to believe about the man in my son's bed. The real reading, the one I caught later, was different. What he actually meant was, I'm not trying to fix it. I've already moved on. I'm still seeing her. I should have known from his phone. Every time it lit up on the coffee table, something changed in his face. Not the face of a man grieving a marriage. The face of a man still chasing the thing that had wrecked it. There's a specific kind of brightness that shows up in a man when a woman is texting him from somewhere he shouldn't be looking, and Ryan had that brightness the whole first week he lived in my apartment. It was a Thursday night about 9 days in, when he leaned in the doorway of my living room while I was half watching a Rays game and asked the question. He said it casually, the way a man asks if you mind if he grabs the last beer. No weight on it. Hands in his pockets, eyes already negotiating with my answer. He said, "Would it bother you if Amanda came by sometime?" I muted the game. I didn't look at him right away. I looked at the television at two men in uniforms arguing with an umpire about a strike zone, and I felt my jaw lock in a way it hadn't locked in months. Because I understood immediately what he was asking, and what he wasn't asking. He wasn't asking to introduce me to his girlfriend. He wasn't asking to bring her over for dinner. He was asking to bring her into my son's bed. That's what the question was. Stripped of the polite phrasing, stripped of the casual posture in the doorway, that was the actual request. The woman he'd torched his marriage for, in Mason's bed, under the dinosaur blanket. I turned and looked at him, and he must have seen something in my face because he started talking faster. Motels were expensive, he said. He wasn't asking to make it a regular thing. He'd keep it low-key. She was discreet. It wouldn't be weird. He'd change the sheets, he'd keep the door shut. He said, "I just don't have a lot of options right now." That sentence is the one I still remember most clearly out of the whole conversation. Not because it was true. It probably wasn't even fully true. A man with a job and a car has options. They're just inconvenient ones. I remember it because of what it did inside my head. It moved the question from, should I allow this, to, how do I refuse without making my friend feel worse than he already does? That's how a man gives up ground without noticing he's giving it up. You let somebody else define the frame, and then you negotiate inside their frame instead of kicking the frame over. I should have kicked the frame over. I should have said, no, not here, not in that room, not in that bed. Not while my son's glove is still on the windowsill and his cars are still under the pillow. I should have said, you can bring her anywhere else on earth, Ryan, but not into the one room in this apartment that belongs to an 8-year-old boy. I should have said, if you can't see why I'm telling you this, then you and I are not the same kind of man, and maybe you shouldn't be staying here at all. I didn't say any of that. What I said was, only when Mason's not here. He nodded fast, relief all over his face. Of course, obviously, only then. What I said was, and you respect the place. Absolutely. What I said was, I mean it, Ryan. That room is my kid's room. Understood. You won't even know she's here. I believed him for about 48 hours, which is, in retrospect, the exact measure of how much I was lying to myself. Because Friday night, before I'd even had time to really sit with what I'd agreed to, I came home from work and found his truck already in the street spot under the palm tree, and a second car parked behind it, a silver Honda with a rosary hanging from the rear view. I knew before I opened my own front door. Inside, the lights were on in my kitchen. My kitchen. There was a pizza box on my counter, 2 glasses of wine already poured, sitting on a placemat I didn't remember owning. And standing next to my refrigerator, with one hand casually resting on the handle like she'd already learned where the cold water was kept, was a woman I had never met before in my life. She turned when I walked in. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize for being there. She didn't do any of the small awkward things a stranger usually does when they're caught inside another person's home. She just smiled, slow and easy, and said my name like Ryan had already told her exactly who I was. She said, "You must be John." And that was the moment, standing in my own doorway with my keys still in my hand, watching a woman I'd never met touch my refrigerator like it belonged to her, that I understood all at once that I had already lost control of my own apartment, and I hadn't even noticed it happening. She said, "You must be John." I should have walked right back out, turned around, locked the door behind me, gone anywhere else, a bar, a diner, the parking lot downstairs, and come back in an hour when the apartment was mine again. Instead, I did what a polite man does when he's been ambushed in his own kitchen. I set my keys on the counter, I shook her hand, and I said, "Nice to meet you," like I meant it. Her name was Amanda. Ryan had said it enough times in the last week that it was already familiar in my mouth before I'd ever used it. What he hadn't told me, because men like Ryan don't know how to warn another man, was that she was the kind of woman who arranged a room around herself without appearing to try. Not loud, not flashy. She was actually soft-spoken, almost careful. She had dark hair pulled loose, a plain white top, jeans, and a perfume so clean and warm it stayed in the doorway after she'd moved out of it. None of that was the thing. The thing was the way she looked at people. She held eye contact half a second longer than you expected, and in that half second, she made you feel like you'd already said something she was curious about before you'd even opened your mouth. I didn't want to notice any of that. I noticed anyway. We ate pizza at my kitchen table. Ryan was performative that night in a way that embarrassed me a little, leaning too close to her, touching the back of her chair, laughing too loud at jokes that weren't jokes. I'd known him for years, and I had never seen him work that hard in front of anyone, including his own wife. Amanda was quieter. She asked me how long I'd lived in the building. She asked which way the neighborhood leaned. Then she saw one of Mason's drawings on the fridge, a crayon dinosaur holding a baseball bat, one of his recurring themes, and she asked about him. What grade, what he liked, whether he played ball yet. I gave short answers because I did not want my son's name in that woman's mouth, not because of her, because of the room she was about to sleep in. Ryan stood up before I'd finished my second slice. He stretched, announced they were turning in, and just like that they were gone down the hallway. I heard Mason's door open. I heard it shut. I heard the lock click. He locked my son's door from the inside. I sat at my kitchen table and I listened to my own apartment stop belonging to me. The television was on low. Some commercial I wasn't watching. I held a beer I'd stopped drinking 6 minutes earlier, and through the wall, exactly the way your body understands these things before your brain has time to be civilized about them, I could hear enough. Not every sound, not every word. Enough shifting on the mattress. Enough muffled laughter. Enough of her voice doing something I did not want to have a mental image of. My 8-year-old slept in that bed under that blanket, and on a Friday night I was sitting in my living room with a dead beer, hearing something I couldn't unhear, feeling 3 things at once. Disgust first. That was clean. Then anger, which was harder because I'd invited it in. Then the third thing, the one I am not proud to name. A small, ugly pulse of envy. Not of Ryan exactly. Of the fact that Want itself had walked into my apartment like it had a reservation, while I sat 6 feet away pretending sports still mattered. That pulse lasted maybe 2 seconds. It was enough to rewire something in me. Because the moment a man feels envy in his own living room over a woman in his son's bed, he has already stopped being the clean party in the situation. He can still behave well, he can still hold the line, but he knows privately that he is no longer the injured spectator he was an hour ago. I went to bed that night without saying goodnight to either of them. I stared at the ceiling and told myself it was one time, one weekend. He'd find a place soon. She'd stop coming over. The apartment would go back to being mine. That lie had about a 7-day lifespan. By the next weekend, Amanda wasn't an event anymore. She was a weekend. Ryan stopped asking me if she could come. He started announcing, "Amanda's coming by later," tossed over his shoulder on his way out the door in the morning, the way you'd mention you were picking up milk. She started showing up on Saturdays with a grocery bag in her arm and letting herself into my kitchen like she had a mug somewhere in the cupboard. One morning I walked out half asleep in sweats to make coffee, and she was already at my counter, pouring from my pot into one of my mugs, and she turned and smiled and asked me how I took it. Such an ordinary sentence. How do you take it? It hit me harder than it had any right to, because that sentence meant she knew where I kept the coffee, It meant she'd opened the cabinet above the stove and found the filters. It meant my apartment had become a place she moved around in, without needing to be told anything. I stood there in socks on my own kitchen floor and realized a woman I hadn't invited into my life was making me coffee in my own home. And I didn't know how to ask her to stop without making it weird, so I said cream, no sugar. And I took the mug, and I drank it. That was the week I started staying out longer than I needed to. I'd work late just to avoid coming home. I'd drive past the apartment once and keep going if I saw her car. I'd sit in a diner near the highway eating eggs I didn't want because I preferred the fluorescent light of a Waffle House to the sound of my own walls on a Saturday. My apartment, the one I'd signed for a loan, the one I'd put forks in the drawers of exactly where I wanted them, stopped being mine on weekends. It became a house where I was the polite guest in the living room, while a couple I had not invited used the rest of it. And then, about 3 weeks into the arrangement, I walked into my own bathroom after a long afternoon with Mason and saw the thong hanging from the faucet handle of my shower, black lace, small enough to be almost nothing. I stopped in the doorway. I want to tell you I was only annoyed. I want to tell you my first reaction was a clean, respectable flash of, how dare they leave that in here? That was my first reaction. It lasted about a breath and a half. Then the second reaction came in, and the second reaction was not respectable. I was a man standing alone in a bathroom, looking at an intimate thing left behind by a woman I had already spent too many nights pretending not to think about. My mind went where a man's mind goes in that situation, and it went fast. I pictured her taking it off. I pictured the room it had come off in. I pictured the sounds I had tried not to hear through the wall. And then I stood there a second longer than I needed to before I looked away, and that extra second is what I can't pretend didn't happen. I picked it up with 2 fingers like it was contaminated, dropped it on the closed toilet lid, got in the shower, and turned the water as hot as I could stand it. Not to clean off a day of work, to burn off whatever had just moved through me. That night I almost threw Ryan out. I rehearsed it at the kitchen sink while he was down the hall in my son's room. I even opened my mouth once when he walked past me for a glass of water. Nothing came out. Part of it was loyalty, part of it was conflict avoidance. Most of it, if I'm being honest now, was that men are extraordinarily good at staying inside situations they know are rotten, as long as nobody makes them describe the rot out loud. Once you say it, you have to act on it. So I didn't say it. I let him stay. I let her keep coming. I let the weekends become a thing I survived instead of lived. 7 weeks in, the rot finally announced itself on its own. Ryan came home one Wednesday night looking wrong. Not the wrong he'd arrived with. Not shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot, marriage imploding wrong. A different wrong, quieter, scooped out. He stood in my kitchen while I reheated leftovers and said, flat as a closed door, "Amanda and I are done." I turned off the microwave. I asked what happened. He shrugged the way men shrug when a lot has happened and none of it is flattering. He said only that things had changed, that she had pulled away, that it was over. I asked if he was okay. He laughed one short, bitter laugh and said, "Does it matter?" I didn't push. I was already standing too close to a fire I hadn't started, and I was not about to throw more oxygen at it. 3 days later, he had his second announcement. Lauren had agreed to let him come back. I smiled when he told me. I actually smiled. I told him that was good news. I told him he was lucky, that a wife willing to reopen a door after something like that was not a small thing, that he should not take it for granted. He nodded. He thanked me. But his face, when I looked at it carefully, was not the face of a man who had been given a second chance at the life he wanted. It was the face of a man who had run out of better options. He wasn't going home. He was returning to a place because there was nowhere else to put the boxes. That sat in my chest wrong, even then. Before anything had happened to me, I could already see he was going back to one life while still bleeding from another. He packed in under an hour, clothes, charger, shaving kit, a pair of boots by my door. He clapped my shoulder at the threshold like we'd survived something together. Maybe we had. Not the same thing, but something. When the door shut behind him, the apartment went quiet in a way I hadn't heard in almost 2 months. I stood in my living room listening to my refrigerator hum. I walked into Mason's room and stood in the doorway. The bed had been stripped and remade, but not the way I made it. The pillow was wrong. The blanket was folded instead of tucked. Small things, wrong things. I remade the bed the way Mason liked it. I put the cars back under the pillow in the order I remembered, and I told myself the story had moved through my home and passed on. That lasted maybe 4 days. Then the calls started. The first one came on a Monday evening, private number. I answered the way I always answer, name, short, tired. There was no voice on the other end, just breath, not heavy breath, not menacing, just a human being on the other side of a phone listening. I waited a few seconds, I said hello again. The line went dead. Wrong number, I thought, stopped thinking about it. The second one came the next evening, same thing. Private number, silence, breath. I said hello twice and hung up first that time. By the fourth call I was irritated. By the sixth I was unsettled. They came at weird hours. Tuesday lunch, Thursday night at 10:40, once on a Saturday morning before my coffee was ready. Always the same. Always a private number. Always a person on the other end, not dead air. Always that specific quality of silence where you can tell somebody is working up the nerve to speak and not finding it. Once, after the 7th or 8th call, I said into the receiver, "If this is a joke, knock it off." The breath on the other side caught. One small, involuntary sound, almost a laugh, almost nothing. Then the line cut. That one stayed with me, because whoever was calling me was not a stranger. A stranger doesn't flinch, a stranger doesn't react. The person on the other end of that call had reacted to my voice. 3 weeks after Ryan moved out, on a Thursday evening just before 7, my intercom buzzed. I'd kicked off my shoes. I'd loosened my tie. I almost didn't answer. Instead, I picked up and said, "Yeah?" A woman's voice, very soft, said, "Hi, it's Amanda." I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it, standing in a sock-footed pause in my own hallway with the intercom receiver against my ear. Because 2 months had passed since I had last heard that voice in my apartment. 2 months of no contact. 2 months of Ryan going back to his wife. 2 months of me telling myself the entire chapter had closed and been shelved. And now she was downstairs, alone, at my door, at 7 in the evening, on a Thursday. I said her name back to her stupidly, like I needed to confirm she existed. Amanda. Yes. I'm downstairs. It took me another beat to ask the question any man should have asked first. Why? A small pause. Then she said, "I wanted to talk to you, if that's okay." Women do not appear at the door of a man they barely know unless something has already been deciding itself in their head for a while. I understood that at the time. I understood it even as I was reaching for the buzzer. I'm not going to pretend I was confused. I was not confused. I was curious in a way a man my age should have known better than to be, and I pressed the button anyway, and I opened my front door before she'd even made it up the stairwell, and that fact alone, that the door was already open when she came around the corner, is the part I cannot pretend away later. She climbed the stairs in a blue dress, casual enough for daytime, fitted enough to make me wish I hadn't noticed. Her hair was down. The same perfume came around the corner 2 steps ahead of her. She gave me a nervous smile that did not match the boldness of having shown up at all. I stepped aside. She crossed my threshold. For a second, neither of us knew what to do with our bodies in that living room. I motioned at the couch. She sat on the edge of it, careful, like she hadn't decided yet whether she'd earned the right to lean back. I asked if she wanted water, coffee, anything. She said, "Do you have wine?" That surprised a laugh out of me. I kept a couple bottles around for dates that hadn't gone anywhere. I brought 2 glasses to the coffee table and sat in the armchair across from her, not the couch, because some small part of my brain was still trying to pretend I was in control of the geometry. She looked more nervous up close than I'd ever seen her look with Ryan. Without him there to fill the air, without the performance of being his girlfriend in somebody else's apartment, she was just a woman twisting the stem of a glass between her fingers in a room that used to hold her as a guest. I said, "So what's going on?" She looked down, then back up. "You know Ryan and I ended things." "Yeah." "And you know he went back to his wife." "Yeah." She nodded. She looked around my living room like the right words might be hidden in the furniture. I waited. I did not help her. Finally, she said, "I didn't come here to talk about him." That sentence changed the temperature of the room. I tried not to react too fast, but my body reacted before my face had a chance to arrange itself. A specific, small tightening in the chest, the kind a man feels when a conversation has just stopped being the conversation he walked into. I crossed one ankle over the other, like that was going to help. I said, "Okay." She took a sip of wine. She exhaled. "This is going to come out wrong no matter how I say it." I said nothing. I had learned in the last 2 months that silence was sometimes the most honest thing I had to offer. She gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I'm not usually like this." That sentence confirmed more than any other sentence could have. A woman only says, "I'm not usually like this," when she knows exactly what she's about to do and wants to tell you in advance that it isn't a pattern. She looked me in the eye. There was no flirtation in it, no softness even. Something more direct than that. Something that had clearly been arguing with itself for weeks and had finally lost. She said, "I ended things with Ryan because I started feeling something for someone else." My mouth went dry. I played dumb. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to hear her say it in a sentence I couldn't misinterpret. I said, "Did you?" She nodded. Then she said, quieter, "You really don't know who." I remember the room going very still. Not literally. The AC was running. A car door slammed somewhere in the parking lot. But inside me, everything focused down to the distance between her mouth and the lip of the wine glass. I said no. Her eyes dropped, then lifted again. "You." One word, 2 letters. It is strange how a single syllable can create thrill and dread in the same breath. My brain flashed through 2 months of images in the span of a second. Ryan at my kitchen table, Amanda's hand on my refrigerator, the thong on the faucet handle, the sounds through the wall, Ryan's face the night he told me she was gone. All of it suddenly being pulled into a different shape, a shape I had not let myself see until she handed it to me out loud. She must have read my silence as rejection, because she started talking fast. She said she knew how it looked. She said she'd never gone after a man this way in her life. She said she'd tried to ignore it. She said the more time she spent in my apartment, the more she noticed me, not Ryan. The way I talked to my son on the phone, the way I listened more than I talked, the way I never once tried to impress her. That last part almost made me laugh because inside my head I had been doing the exact opposite for weeks. Then she said the sentence that locked the whole thing into place. She said, "The private calls were me." I stared at her. "What?" Her face went red. "I know, it's embarrassing. I kept dialing. I kept freezing. I couldn't figure out what to say." Every silent call suddenly had a face. Every breath I'd listened to, every small caught almost laugh, every hang-up. Her. All of it her. She had been trying to say exactly what she had finally walked up a flight of stairs to say, and she had been failing at it for weeks, and I had been sitting on my couch the whole time thinking I was being harassed when really I was being wanted. A decent man would have paused there. A decent man would have said, "You need to leave, this is too much, we shouldn't be in this room alone." A smarter man would at least have bought himself a day. I was not either of those men that night, because the truth, the ugly, unvarnished truth I have to put down for this story to mean anything, is that every single thing she said about weeks of wanting, I had been matching it from my side of the wall the whole time. She had been dialing and freezing. I had been hearing her through a wall and pretending I wasn't. I asked one weak question, the only kind of resistance I had left. I said, "Does Ryan know you're here?" She shook her head. "No." That was the last warning I was going to get, and I walked right past it. I set my wine glass on the coffee table. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to. 1 second I was in the armchair trying to think like a decent human being, and the next, I was standing in front of her close enough to smell the wine on her breath, and she was looking up at me, and she was not pulling back. I kissed her, and in that moment, in the exact second my mouth touched hers in the same living room where my friend had sat drinking beer 8 weeks before, I knew 2 things at once. With the clarity of a man who had just crossed a line he would never get back across. The first thing I knew was that this was going to cost me more than I could yet name. The second thing I knew was that Ryan was going to find out. She stayed. Not in Mason's room, in mine. I'm not going to turn that night into poetry, because it wasn't poetry. It was hunger and relief and built-up pressure finally getting a door kicked open, and what stayed with me afterward wasn't even the sex. It was the small, quiet thing that came after, her head on my chest, her finger tracing a slow circle on my shoulder, her asking a soft, careful question about my son, what he was like, whether he was shy, whether he took after me, as if she were already measuring the shape of a life that had my child in it. I should have felt like I'd won something. I felt split down the middle instead. Morning didn't fix it. Morning sharpened it. She woke up before me, wandered into my kitchen in one of my t-shirts, because she hadn't packed anything, and stood at my counter barefoot making coffee like she belonged there. I walked out still half asleep, and for one uncalibrated second before my brain caught up to my life, it actually looked like peace. A woman in my kitchen, sunlight on the floor, the smell of coffee in a pot I owned. Then she turned around, kissed me once and asked, "So what now?" That question hung in the air for the next 4 months of my life. I told myself the clean things. She's not Ryan's property. They were done before I touched her. Grown adults don't owe a third grown adult their future just because he once slept in their spare room. Those arguments were true. They were also underneath the exact kind of truth a man reaches for when he's already decided what he wants to do. What I wanted was more of her, so we kept going. Fast. A dinner out on the other side of town where nobody from the warehouse would see us. A Saturday drive to the beach with the windows down and her hand resting on my thigh like it had always belonged there. A motel 1 week, my apartment the next, then back to my apartment again, because secrecy only lasts as long as 2 people are scared enough to protect it, and we weren't scared enough. I was not in love yet. That would be a lie. But I was deep enough in whatever it was that I stopped pretending I could walk out of it clean. The crack showed up inside the good months. That's what made them worse. You can survive bad weeks. What wears a man down is sitting across from a woman you're falling for while her phone lights up on the table face down, and her face changes for half a second before she flips it over, and neither of you says anything about it. That happened at a seafood place near Clearwater on a Tuesday. I saw his name, Ryan, flashed on the lock screen. She turned the phone over before the notification was fully gone. I said, "Is he still contacting you?" She hesitated half a beat too long. "Sometimes." "How often?" "Too often." Then she waved it off, said he was having trouble letting go, said she hadn't answered most of it, said she didn't want to upset me by bringing it up. That last sentence was the one that stuck in my teeth, because somebody deciding for you which truths you're allowed to handle is not protection, it's management. I just spent the last 2 years of my marriage on the receiving end of that exact pattern, and here I was eating grouper across from a woman who had already started doing a softer version of the same thing. I let it sit. I let it sit because I wanted to finish dinner. I let it sit because we were going to her place after. I let it sit because desire at that stage of a new relationship will cash checks your conscience cannot cover. And I had been cashing a lot of them. Then, on a Monday morning, Ryan came in late and walked across the warehouse floor straight toward my desk. I knew before he opened his mouth, I knew from 30 feet away. His jaw was set. His eyes had a flatness I had never seen on him in the 8 years I'd known him. Not the flatness of exhaustion, the flatness of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was now just closing the distance to do it. Conversations around us started thinning out. A guy named Dale by the printer stopped typing. Another guy behind me set a clipboard down on a shelf so softly it made no sound at all. You could feel the room reorganize itself to watch. Ryan stopped in front of my desk. He did not sit. He did not lower his voice. He said, loud enough for everyone in the back half of the building to hear, "You've been after her since the beginning, haven't you?" My stomach went out from under me. I stood up. I don't know if I stood up because I needed the height or because my body had decided, before my brain, that what was coming was not the kind of conversation you take sitting down. I said, "Keep your voice down." He didn't. He pointed at me. A full index finger, the way a man points at another man when he wants a room of witnesses to do the indexing for him. He said, "You let me stay in your place while you were eyeing her the whole time. You're a snake." Snake. That word went through me like a cold wire, because the ugly part of me, the part that had stood an extra second in a bathroom looking at a black thong, the part that had felt an envy pulse through a wall on a Friday night, the part that had opened its front door before Amanda had even made it up the stairwell, that part of me heard snake and couldn't argue the whole word off. Not every letter of it was wrong. That was the problem. It wasn't entirely wrong. It was just unfairly complete. I said as evenly as I could, "That's not what happened. Nothing happened while you were at my place. Lower your voice and we'll talk." He laughed in my face. It wasn't a real laugh. It was the laugh of a humiliated man who needed his humiliation to sound like something else. He said, "You expect me to believe that?" By that point, I could feel every pair of eyes in the warehouse on my face. A driver named Pete had stopped in the doorway with a clipboard he was pretending to read. One of the younger guys was staring openly, not even trying to hide it, because at 22 you haven't yet learned that some scenes are not meant to be watched. I could hear the refrigeration unit humming in the break room. I could hear a forklift beeping in reverse somewhere past the loading bay. The whole building had gone to the kind of quiet that only happens when a lot of people are pretending not to listen. Ryan stepped closer. He said, "So what? She just happened to leave me and run to you? That's your story?" I wanted to say yes, because in the most literal, technical sense, that was the story. She ended it with him. He went back to his wife. She came to my door 3 weeks later. No overlap. Clean timeline. But even inside my own head, I could hear how that sounded in a warehouse at 10 in the morning in front of 11 men in work boots, and I knew nobody standing there was going to buy clean timelines from a guy who'd ended up with his friend's mistress. He called Amanda a name I will not put in this story. Then he called me a worse one. His shoulders tightened. His hands opened and closed at his sides. For about 2 seconds, I really did think he was going to take a swing at me. And I remember very clearly the exact calculation my brain did in that moment. Not how do I defend myself, but which story travels further through this building, me getting punched or me swinging back. I'd already lost. The only question left was how the loss got told at lunch. My manager came out of his office. You could feel the whole room re-tense around his walk. He was a lean, bald man named Greg, who had been in the business long enough to know what a public blow-up between 2 veteran employees cost. He stepped into the aisle between our desks and said, "What the hell is this?" Ryan didn't even look at him. He turned back to me and said to Greg, still looking at me, ask him how long he's been sleeping with her." The room got so quiet I heard the AC cycle. I cannot describe to you what that specific quiet feels like as the subject of it. Shame is the closest word, but it isn't complete. Shame is private. This was public shame, which is a different animal entirely. Shame multiplied by witnesses. Shame that has already started becoming other people's story before you've even had the chance to tell your own version. I could feel it happening in real time. By lunch, this conversation would be at 3 separate tables. By the end of the day, it would be in a group text. By tomorrow, it would be a thing men I barely knew would decide about me before I walked into a room. My face went hot. Not red with anger hot, the other kind. The kind where the skin on your scalp tightens and your jaw feels too small for your teeth. I said, "This isn't a work conversation." Ryan smiled without any part of his face smiling. "No, it's a betrayal conversation." Betrayal. That word did something snake hadn't, because snake is a slur, and slurs can be rejected. Betrayal is a category, and a category sticks. Betrayal implies a duty. Betrayal implies a breach. I had spent 2 months telling myself that Amanda was not Ryan's to lose, that he had no claim on her once they were done, that adults make their own choices. All of that may have been technically defensible. Betrayal was still the word that fit the room best, because the room was not going to do moral geometry for me. The room was just going to watch a man get named. Greg said, "Outside, both of you, now." Ryan looked at me one more time. His eyes had water in them, not crying water, the other kind. The kind a man's eyes get when pride is the only thing keeping something in. He said, "We're not done." Then he turned and walked off the floor. I stood there at my desk with the whole warehouse watching. Nobody moved for a second. Then the younger guy looked away. Then Dale went back to typing, too fast on a keyboard he wasn't really using. Then the building remembered how to breathe and the sound came back. Forklift, refrigerator, the rattle of a roll-up door somewhere in the back. But the sound wasn't the same sound. Every noise in that building now had my name inside it. I grabbed my keys and went after him. Not because I thought the conversation was going to go better outside. Because letting a man walk off a job site with that much rage in him meant whatever came next was going to come out somewhere worse. He was by the loading area, smoking. He had quit 2 years ago. That told me everything about where he was. He took one long drag and looked at me like he did not know me anymore. I said, "Listen to me." He said, "I've listened to enough." I took another step. "Nothing happened while you were at my place. I swear to you, not one thing." He flicked ash onto the pavement. "So that's your defense." "It's the truth." He stared at me for a long second. Then he shook his head, very slow, and said, "You really think that matters?" And there it was. The whole thing stripped down to one sentence. Because he was right. It didn't matter, not to him. The emotional math had already been done inside his head, and the emotional math said, I brought her into his apartment, and she chose him, and he chose her back. Facts weren't going to rearrange that math. Timelines weren't going to rearrange that math. Nothing I said, however technically accurate, was going to unshape what had already taken shape in him. I tried once more anyway. I told him she had come to me after. I told him I had not planned it. I even said stupidly the most cowardly thing a man can say in that situation. I said I had thought about telling him and hadn't known how. He laughed at that one. I will remember that laugh until I'm dead. He said, "You thought about telling me, wow, how honorable of you." Then he stepped close enough that I could smell the cigarette on him, and he said, quieter than anything else he'd said all morning, the sentence that did the actual damage. He said, "You know what the worst part is, John? I actually trusted you." I did not have an answer. There is no answer to that sentence. Every version of a defense I could have made would have sounded like a man trying to buy his way out of a debt with the wrong currency. He dropped the cigarette. He crushed it under his boot. He said, "Stay away from me." Then he walked to his truck, and he drove out of that parking lot so fast the tires kicked gravel across the side of my own car, and I stood there in the heat with my shirt sticking to my back, staring at the spot where he had just been, knowing 3 things at once. I had lost him. That was 1. I had lost the room inside that building. That was 2. And the third thing, the thing I could not yet fully admit, but could already feel starting to walk toward me across the asphalt, Amanda, somewhere on the other side of the city, at that exact moment, knew more about how Ryan had found out than she had ever told me. I just didn't know it yet. She called that afternoon before I even got home. I answered on the second ring, already pulled over in a grocery store parking lot, because I didn't trust myself to keep driving, and I said 3 words. "He knows." There was a pause on her end, not the surprised kind, the bracing kind. She said very softly, "He talked to you. He came at me in front of half the building." She inhaled like somebody pulling a bandage off a wound she had been hiding for a while. Then she said, "I'm sorry." I gripped the steering wheel. I already knew. I didn't want to know yet, but I knew. "How did he find out, Amanda?" Silence. I said her name again. She said, "I told him." I want to tell you my reaction was clean. It wasn't. It wasn't pure anger. It was the slow, sick drop of understanding that the woman I had been falling for had been quietly carrying a version of the story I hadn't been shown. The private calls on her phone hadn't been harassment. They had been him pressing and pressing and pressing, and her finally giving him my name to make him go away. He had cornered her outside a pharmacy the week before, she said. He wouldn't leave. He kept asking who. He kept asking if it was someone from her job. He kept asking if it was someone she had known before him, and eventually, because she was tired and afraid and did not know how to make him stop, she said the one word that would shut him up. John. Once it was out, she said, there was no taking it back. I sat in that parking lot with the engine off and felt the tired thing under the anger. Because the worst part wasn't that she had told him. The worst part was that she hadn't told me, she had told him. She had let me walk into a warehouse that morning completely blind, while the information that was about to detonate on my face had already been sitting in her pocket for 7 days. That wasn't protection. That was management. And I had promised myself after my marriage that I would never again let a woman manage my truth for me. I should have ended it right there in that parking lot. I didn't. She came over that night with red eyes and no makeup, and I opened my door already rehearsing speeches that collapsed the second I saw her face, and we talked for 3 hours on my couch, and she cried, and I didn't. And when she left at midnight, we were still together. That is the part that is hardest to tell, honestly, because it is not the part where I stood up for myself. It is the part where I stayed. Loving somebody and being furious at them are not opposite things. They live in the same chest. Anyone who tells you otherwise has never actually been in it. For a long time after that, life got quieter in a way that felt like healing, and was mostly just exhaustion. Ryan transferred to another branch. The warehouse stopped watching me. The private calls stopped. Amanda blocked him. Months passed, then more months. Then one Tuesday afternoon, a year later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and it was Lauren. I had not spoken to her since the grocery store parking lot. Her voice had that careful, over-controlled calm of a woman who had rehearsed a sentence enough times to keep it from shaking inside her mouth. She asked if I had a minute. I pulled over again. Different parking lot. Same instinct. She said she was leaving Ryan. For good this time. I asked if she was okay. She said she would be. I asked why she was calling me. And here is the sentence that rearranged everything I thought I knew about the last year and a half of my life. She said, "Because I think you've been carrying something that was never only yours to carry." Then she told me the rest. She had tried to rebuild with him. He had come home full of remorse for about 6 weeks, and then remorse had curdled into resentment. And resentment had curdled into self-pity, and every fight had eventually circled back to how trapped he had always felt. There had been other lies, money lies, a credit card she hadn't known about, a second phone. He was extraordinarily good at apologizing and extraordinarily bad at changing, and she had finally understood the difference between those two things. Then she said the sentence I wrote down inside my head word for word. She said, "Ryan needs somebody to blame so he doesn't have to sit alone with himself for very long. For a while that was me. Then it was Amanda. Then it was you. It was always going to be somebody." I didn't answer. She said, "I'm not calling to tell you you did nothing wrong. You did things wrong. So did I. So did she. But you are not the reason his life fell apart. He was the reason his life fell apart." I thought you should hear that from me. Then she wished me well and she hung up, and I sat in that parking lot for a long time without starting the engine. That phone call did not make me clean. I want to be specific about that. I had still opened my door when I shouldn't have. I had still crossed a line a better man would not have crossed. I had still kissed a woman in a living room that had, 3 weeks earlier, hosted my best friend's collapsing marriage. None of that got erased by one phone call from his wife. What the call did was give the story back its real proportions. I had been carrying Ryan's version of it for a year. His version cast me as the architect. Lauren's version cast me as one of several people who had touched a fire he had lit himself. Both of those versions had some truth. Only one of them was the whole picture, and it wasn't his. Amanda moved in with me 6 months later. Not all at once. A dresser first, then books, then finally the rest. Mason was 10 by then. He liked her. Jenna was cautious at first, then relaxed. Then one Christmas Eve stood in my kitchen laughing over a pie crust Amanda had botched, and I understood, without anyone announcing it, that a real life had quietly assembled itself around me while I wasn't watching. Ryan never came back. No apology, no reconciliation, no late-night message years later saying he finally saw it differently. Once somebody said he had taken a job in Georgia. Another time somebody said he was living with a woman up there. I never followed up. At some point, the absence itself became the answer. There was a night, years into all of it, when I was clearing out Mason's old closet. He was 15 by then, taller than me. Embarrassed by his own childhood, and I found the dinosaur blanket folded in the back behind a shoebox of broken toys. I held it in my hands, and I sat down on the edge of his bed. And that, not the kiss, not the warehouse, not the phone call from Lauren, was my real thumbnail moment. Because holding that blanket, I finally understood where the whole story had actually gone wrong. And it wasn't the night I opened my door to Amanda. It wasn't the afternoon she told me she had picked me. It was earlier than all of it. It was the Tuesday afternoon I let another man put his mess into my son's bedroom and told myself I was being generous, when what I was actually being was afraid of what saying no would make me look like. Not all kindness is kindness. Sometimes it is cowardice wearing a nicer shirt. Sometimes the hardest no a man can say is the one that would have protected everybody, including himself, from every ugly thing that came after. I lost a friend I once would have called a brother. I know that now. I kept a love I never would have chosen the ugly way it started. I know that too, and I learned finally that the moment you let somebody else's chaos live inside your house, you stop being a spectator in it. You become part of the weather. And every person underneath that roof, your friend, your son, the woman who hasn't walked in yet, and the man you thought you were, every single one of them pays the price of a door you should have kept closed. I keep the blanket now, folded in my own closet where I can see it. What would you do in this situation? Be honest, or did this remind you of someone? Tell me in the comments. And if this made you think about your own relationship, I left something in the description that can help you build something stronger. Subscribe if you want more stories like this every day, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story.